mute the video. Just mute the host will mute all the mics for you. And then, Miss Tan, make sure you unmute your mic after the video.
After the video, unmute my mic? You mean at 11 o'clock, right? When I start?
10 a.m. Yes, 10 a.m.
Sorry,
after the
not
video.
11, 10.
After the video. Yeah, then you can start your introduction.
All right. Okay. Sure.
Okay.
Sure.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Malaysia Chamber of Commerce (MCCC) was established in 1990 as a non-governmental, non-profit, multi-ethnic and independent business association. MCCC provides a dynamic platform for Malaysian and Chinese entrepreneurs to create a mutually beneficial environment for business cooperation, enhancing the national economy and boosting enterprise development.
马总统商会创会的前辈一开始就给我们这个商会很清楚的定位，它是设计马来西亚各族的商家有兴趣到中国经贸和投资的一个未来的两国的一个发展的新动力，必然是来自高科技，包括于人才的培养。 马总统商会青年团是在2003年4月份成立，并在2018年我们改名为青年企业家委员会青企会，以更贴近企业家的思想。作为青年的商业平台，青企会也通过举办各种各样的活动，让他们装备好自己，迎接更多的商机。
我觉得21世纪女企业家 通过这个平台走出马来西亚，然后走入全中国。我们不只是要学习如何做一个成功的女企业家，更重要的是我们要如何成为一个更有价值的女企业家。
As a platform for connecting private enterprises and government resources, the MCCC has been maintaining close contact with the government departments of the two countries to ensure the exchange of resources and projects, domestic and foreign investment opportunities, encouraging and implementing the international expansion strategy.
马中关系源远流长，经过了45年的这个紧密合作，经贸之间的这个成长，马中的关系呢更上一层楼。我们在未来展望双边友好邦国的关系，朝向新的里程碑迈进。
As a platform for international interaction, the professional teams of the association and the 9 state administrative branches have successfully encouraged numerous numbers of Chinese investors to collaborate with local entrepreneurs over the years.
MCCC being a focused China-Malaysia Trade Organization. It opens up a new avenue for us to look at trading with China. China is a country that we cannot ignore. It's humongous and the trade opportunities are big.
MCCC not only enables Malaysian entrepreneurs to experience the prosperity of Malaysia-China business, but also enables the Chinese entrepreneurs to experience the diversity of Malaysian culture. This has boosted the confidence of cooperating with local businesses, therefore strengthening trade development. In order to truly understand China's economic status, MCCC led local entrepreneurs on a visit to the commercial hub in Nanjing, China, and to meet the local entrepreneurs there. MCCC started a course related to the investments in China and Malaysia, organizing the One Belt, One Road English Forum. MCCC also organized a Greater Glory 45th anniversary of Malaysia-China diplomatic relations to celebrate the close relations and the rich historical ties, to further encourage the economic development and maintain the high accelerated growth between Malaysia and China.
马中总商会自1990年成立以来，积极地发挥桥梁和纽带的作用。今天的中马关系已经进入了新的历史阶段，必将迎来更大的发展机遇和更广阔的发展空间。
The rapid growth and increase of business activities in China make it a globally coveted market. Malaysia's strength lies in its stable, growing economy and multicultural environment.
3, 2, 1.
对于马中总商会未来的发展，马中总商会一定要尽量的有一个机制，能够授权给我们的各个委员会、各州的州本会，让他们有这个领域、这个舞台去表现他们各自的才华。这一点是我们这个总商会会成功的一个要素。
Regardless of the business nature, choosing only the strongest and advanced platform is the most effective method to venture into any foreign market.
Hello, a very good morning to everyone. Thank you all for joining the webinar today. First of all, I would like to thank the organizer, Malaysia-China Chamber of Commerce, for having Repsa and myself to moderate this really interesting and pertinent session. I will, if you may, I will just start. It's 10 o'clock, so we can try and keep on time to the webinar. The topic that we will discuss today is very pertinent, given the current ongoing COVID-19 pandemic and the subsequent economic crisis that we and the whole world is in. Now, one of the key fears and angst that a lot of us are experiencing is the uncertainty that came along with the unknown. And as countries, Malaysia included, continue to fight the fire by announcing different packages and measures to sustain the economy and keep the jobs alive and keep livelihoods intact, I think it's very important that we have a discussion on the topic of today's session. So let's get stuck into it. So I would just like to give a brief overview on the Malaysia scenario. As far as I think it was yesterday and the day before, Malaysia's Q1 2020 GDP grew by only 0.7% from 3.6% in Q4 2019. Now, this is the lowest since the 2008 crisis, but for now, still in the positive territory. Obviously, this result is hugely impacted by the MCO restrictions and the lack of consumption, etc., etc. And as it happened, the government yesterday further announced an economic recovery plan of a total of 35 billion ringgit, Malaysia, with key incentives like the wage subsidy program extended for, I think, another 3 months for businesses that are not allowed to operate, incentives to hire those without jobs, multiple loan schemes for affected sectors like tourism, etc., tax reliefs, various digitalization initiatives, etc. The total fiscal injection, I think, measures to about 10 billion ringgit Malaysia out of the 35 billion. And all this is on top of the 260 billion stimulus package announced earlier in March and in April. So assuming that we are in this for the long game, I think it begs the question of how can we pay for this? How can we fund this spending sustainably to ensure that rightfully the government is providing a strong safety net for the citizens, for businesses, and at the same time attempting to build a resilient economy. And to a large extent, I think there is plenty of arguments to conclude that what has been announced thus far are actually relief measures rather than stimulus measures, because essentially they are meant not just to stimulate the economy, but they are meant to sort of do a bit of fire-saving bandit solution to try and cover whatever losses that we have seen so far. So personally, I prefer to relate it as a relief measures. But essentially, we may want to consider whether the government should let the size, the quantum of the stimulus be dictated by the amount they think they can spend or the amount that they think they need to keep the company going. So I think this is also a question that we can perhaps have a discussion about. So we have with us here 3 very esteemed speakers this morning to share their experience and insights. Very good morning and thank you very much for joining us. Without further ado, I would like to invite our first speaker, Dato Aziz, to take the floor. Dato Aziz is the Economic Advisor of Islamic Chamber of Commerce and President of the Malaysia Association of Tax Accountants.
Yeah.
So if I may, Dato Aziz, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. All right, thank you, Ihan. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Fellow speakers, Mr. Ravi, Professor Wu, members of MCCC, members of DPIM and MATA, and of course the MCC webinar viewers and participants. First of all, thank you very much, MCCC, for inviting me to share my views on how to fund, or shall I say, other options of funding social and economic safety net during and after COVID-19 pandemic. If there is an after COVID-19 pandemic, we don't know. Hopefully, inshallah, there'll be. We should be able to find some vaccine to counter the COVID-19 pandemic. All right. How many minutes do I have, Ihan? 15 minutes?
Yep, you have about 10 to 15 minutes. That's fine.
10 to 15 minutes. Okay, I'll try to finish, keep within the time. Okay, I will start off my presentation with a brief introduction of DPIM Mata, at least for the viewers' interest. And then, let me start off. Okay. All right. Okay, the presentation outline for today, the introduction, a very brief one on DPIM Mata, and lessons learned. What have we learned from the COVID-19 pandemic? Its effects on the individual, the economy, the business entity particularly, effects to the government, and are there or do we have any other options and alternatives of funding the social and economic safety net? And I'll try to conclude within the 15 minutes time frame, inshallah. All right, Dewan Perdagangan Islam Malaysia, or DPIM in short, or Malaysia Islamic Chamber of Commerce, established in 1993, a non-profit organization that championed business jihad. Basically, what business jihad means is actually it is actually like, hang on, business jihad is actually like steps taken to integrate the Muslim companies into the global economic mainstream and be amongst the world big corporate names. Corporate wakaf is actually a term used for donation and contribution of assets for charitable purposes with no intention of reclaiming the assets back. That is corporate wakaf. And I think everybody knows about halal economy and business which are Sharia compliant. Basically, what Sharia compliance means in brief is actually the Islamic religious law that governs the way we do things, like the way we conduct the business. All right, back to Mata. Malaysian Association of Tax Accountants is a professional association established in 1988. Which governs the licensed tax practitioners in Malaysia, approved by the Ministry of Finance. What we normally do is actually, normally when tabling of the budget, the 2020-2021 budget in October this year, what we do is actually we analyze the budget and we will have conference and seminars all over Malaysia to educate the public and the business community on the tax updates happening in Malaysia. We also send or we propose our memorandum. We give proposal to the Ministry of Finance on how to best to help to assist the people, the rakyat, and the business community. Okay, that is basically what we do. All right. Okay, now what are the lessons learned from COVID-19 pandemic? We know after the Asian financial crisis in 1987-88, global financial crisis 2008-2009, the next big thing that happened to us globally, internationally, is the COVID-19 pandemic. Of course, it has significantly affected and still will continue to affect the people, the economy, and also the government fiscal position. Truly, this is a wake-up call for us individually, locally, globally, and the business community to evaluate. We have to assess, realign, make adjustments, adapt, improvise, strategize, and take corrective actions and make systematic and effective future plans. All right, what are the financial economics and in terms of perspective of financial economics, lessons learned to the individual? All right, individually, ideally, I say ideally, each of us should have sufficient reserve as part of our contingency plan to weather unforeseen circumstances or events such as COVID-19 pandemic. I know not everybody will agree with me because at this point of time, we don't even have enough fund individually to put aside to set the reserve. But bear in mind, in financial planning, what we have to do is actually to put aside first a certain percentage of amount as our reserves. Normally, it's about 10% in financial planning area, and it should sustain for about 3 to 6 months for us to sustain without income. Ideally, that is the amount of you should put aside as reserve. Another very important thing, I think we should know that the importance of record keeping. I do my record keeping every day, every night before I go to sleep. How much I spend, how much income I earn, and it is being updated every day before I go to sleep. So I keep control of my financial position or financial situation. All right, disciplines in savings and prudent spending are very crucial. Of course, I think AKPK, Bank Negara, they are educating the people on this matter. We need to be innovative, creative, able, and willing to work to survive during this adverse situation. I know a lot of people has been retrenched and not able to work, and they have resort to doing Grab delivery, food delivery. At least they are earning income and able to survive at this point of time. Okay, the business entities. All right, all business entities, especially micro business and small medium enterprise, should have business plan. I know, again, Machikia, which sells nasi lemak, don't even have an idea of a business plan. But I think, personally, we think that they should have a little bit knowledge of some business plan, some financial plan for them to survive. At least they know how much profit they make every day. Because we understand that normally the micro business, as long as they have enough working capital for the next day, they are not bothered about the profit margin that they've made. I think it is time for the people, especially the petty traders and the micro business people, to really understand about some business plan and financial plan for them. Of course, the proper record keeping and financial management are very important. Adequate and sufficient reserves as individual. We need to have at least about 3 to 6 months reserve to sustain. Alternative plan for financial assistance in case of emergency. Companies or business entities should have some sort of overdraft facility that can only be utilized during, you should do that, in fact, in terms of when a standby credit, for example, during emergency. Okay, to the government. We know that, as Ihan has rightly put it, a lot of money has been spent to stimulate the economy. I think the last stimulus package was about 67 billion. I think that was about 6 or 7 years ago. Now we are having another stimulus package of 260 billion. And yesterday, the short-term economic recovery plan, another 35 billion. If you look back at the Malaysian economic growth, as per the economic outlook report when tabling of the budget last year, we have targeted our growth to be about 4.8%. And we know after the COVID-19 pandemic, definitely we won't reach that 4.8%. In fact, it will go the other way around, meaning there will be a contraction in terms of the economic growth. Of course, decrease in tax revenue will happen. We were supposed to have a tax revenue of about 190 billion in 2020. But looking at business unable to operate, hence there's no revenue coming in and there's no profit. And workers and the salaried group workers, the taxpayers are being retrenched. So less people paying salary, being taxed for salary they earn. So definitely there will be a decrease in tax revenue for 2020. I don't think we will make that 190 billion mark for 2020. Subsidies and social assistance as per the economic report. In 2019, we have spent about 23 billion. 2020, we were supposed to spend about 24 billion after the COVID-19 or during the COVID-19 pandemic. I think it has ballooned up. It's quite substantial. I don't know what is the amount, but I think it's going to be quite huge in terms of the amount of subsidies and social assistance given by the government to the people. Because of that, of course, the deficit status of the fiscal position of the government, the country, we were supposed to get about 3.2% of GDP in terms of deficit, but personally, I think it will increase to about maybe about 5.5 to 6%. But we should not be overly concerned about this deficit status in terms of fiscal status of the government, because in terms of, like for example, if spending, the productive spending and the spending by the government is actually for helping the people and to stimulate their business, especially the economy, I think we are okay. It is not being spent irresponsibly in terms of the spending of the government's money. Of course, the debt status, it is our cap is about 55% of GDP. In 2019, it's about 52.7%. We need to understand that when companies don't make business, no revenues, of course, the GDP will reduce. But our debt status, the amount of debt will remain. We need to look at this percentage of debt against GDP because we don't produce, meaning the GDP will be lower. In 2020, I think it is about 1.5 or 1.4 trillion. I don't think in 2020, this year, the real figure will be around that area. So we really need to have a look at the percentage of debt over GDP, right? So another point that I need to note is actually the importance of political stability in economics decision-making. All this while, Malaysia has been politically stable. That is actually our strength. In terms of looking at from the international community perspective. But now, unfortunately, we are not stable politically. And I sincerely hope that when we make economic decisions, it is not based on political issues or political sentiment. It is good. I commend the government of appointing the new Ministry of Finance, Dato Zafrul. I hope that he doesn't go into politics. Concentrate on the social and economics on the finance side, because he's as it is until now, decision in terms of economics are very commendable. Very good policies are being crafted out by the Ministry of Finance. Congratulations, Finance Minister. Okay, lessons learned from the current situation. The government. Individually, I think to sum up, especially the vulnerable group, we are uncertain of our future. We don't know what's going to happen because of the COVID-19. And most business entities, especially the micro business and the SMEs, are unable to survive during this trying time. And the question now is, are measures taken by the government sufficient enough to save the people, the business community, and the economy? After the presentation, the economic recovery plan yesterday, I think for the time being, or as it is now, the government are doing quite well in terms of crafting up policies and measures to help the business, the individual, the rakyat, and the people. Hopefully, this will go on. These are some of the measures taken by the government during the 260 billion assistance, Bantuan Prihatin of 11.5 billion. The SOCSO wage subsidy program of 7.9 billion. This is only for 3 months, and yesterday it was extended to another 3 months. So this figure will be increased. Prihatin screening program by Pekeso. EPF, Ayah Lestari, about 1.9 billion withdrawal every month by the EPF members, we as the members of KWSP. Grant for micro business and SMEs of 2.1 billion. This has been increased yesterday as well to help the SMEs. And how to fund the safety net. Currently, the government is utilizing its funds. This will definitely have an impact on the fiscal position, as I mentioned, but we are not overly concerned of the fiscal position because the funding and the spending by the government is actually to help the people and the business community. SOCSO, there will be decrease in funds, EPF decrease in member savings for retirement because we are drawing out our retirement funds every month. And we need to have alternative source for funding economic and social safety net initiatives. Okay, proposal number 1, setting up of National Economic and Social Safety Net Fund. In short, I call it NEST Fund. So what we do is actually to encourage the business companies and business entities to contribute to this fund, and these people will be getting a double deductions under Income Tax Act 1967 for cash contributions made to NEST Fund. Currently, what the tax policies and measures is actually these companies are getting allowable or approved donations, but it is capped at about 10% of the aggregate income. So it's quite limited in terms of their intention in terms of donating or contributing to this the fund. So what we suggest is actually a double deduction. This will give a better tax incentive. This will at least entice the companies and the business entity to contribute and to donate. And we suggest that the fund is being managed by the Ministry of Finance. The second proposal is to encourage the approved institution and organizations under Section 44(6) of the Income Tax Act. The list of the approved institution, we can look at it in the Lembaga Hasil Dalam Negeri website. Some of all the yayasan and foundation that are approved under this Section 44(6). So, and the companies and again with the business entities, when they donate or contribute to this yayasan, they will be given, specifically for the COVID-19 issue, will be given a double deduction, we suggest. Okay, the other thing, maybe the insurance companies or the government can consider business interruption insurance coverage, because like we know, they have the business community, we have cash flow problem. We cannot operate, meaning we cannot earn revenue, we cannot make profit. So if there's, I think there's maybe I don't know, maybe Prof and Mr. Ravi can enlighten me on this. Maybe there should be some sort of insurance coverage for business interruption to cover the profit that would have been earned normally for a business, and cover fixed costs and other costs that still to be incurred by business entities during the business interruption period. And interest-free loan by the financial institutions. Last proposal, corporate wakaf. What DPIM is doing is actually a contribution and donation of assets, land, building, equipment, cash, and other assets for charitable purposes, with no intention of reclaiming the assets back. For example, donation of medical equipment under DPIM is doing this now. Okay, to conclude, we need each and every one of us as individual, business entity and government must learn. We need to learn from this COVID-19 experience, be it in terms of individual, business entities, government. We need to learn. We need to have enough reserve for unforeseen circumstances like this. We need to prioritize social and economics matters above politics. And we as a whole accept and adapt the new norm, health and social issue best practices, go into digital economy, digitalize your operation, marketing, do things differently. And lastly, human governance as the core value in politics. With that, I conclude my presentation. Back to you, Ihan. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dato Aziz. Thank you for the very enlightening slides and the discussions that you go through. I think all the figures that you shared shown that we're actually in sort of uncharted territories. Yes. Because as we say, as you mentioned, tax revenue seems to be, well, it's expected to be dropping. Yeah. GDP growth, as I mentioned earlier, just for this Q1, it has dropped tremendously from 3.9 to 0.7%. So GDP growth has dropped. Yeah. Consumption has dropped. Exports and imports are severely affected, impacted. But I think at the same time, we also need to spend, right? We also need to ensure that people's jobs are kept and livelihoods are taken care of. So I think one point that I gather from what you mentioned at the end in terms of the suggestions is a sort of a whole of society approach where you are actually saying that the points that you mentioned on businesses contributing to funds and charities, and all that. I think your last point where you mentioned about putting out lands and things like that. Can you explain a little bit more in terms of are we talking about a mindset shift where we need businesses and corporations also to be in the game, because we are in this all together, and if we don't really sort of look out for each other, then we're all in the same boat essentially. Can you explain a little bit more on that concept that you have for this approach?
Okay, thank you. All right. So basically, what corporate wakaf means is actually like it is a bit different because normally in a financial or conventional economics, what we do is actually when we donate or contribute, is normally all cash contributions or medical equipment, for example. But in corporate wakaf, what we do is actually we donate assets in terms of land and building. I'll give you an example. Like in Cairo, in terms of, I think University Al-Azhar. So it is actually a wakaf concept. So what they did is actually was, donating a plot of land and building a building to educate the people. So in terms of education, and you produce people, human capital in terms of, that is the value that wakaf does. So basically, in terms of ownership of assets, it is being passed to an organization that manage the wakaf, and in terms of the assets, you produce things. For example, like medical equipment, for example, ventilators and all those things. What DPM is doing now is actually donating the ventilators and the medical equipment to the hospitals. So meaning like you donate without intention of getting back. But medical equipment, of course, it's actually quite a small amount if you compare to land and building. So in corporate wakaf, actually we do that. So the reason why we do that is actually, the hereafter deeds that we get, so those are the things that we do in terms of corporate wakaf. It is a bit difficult. So the important thing is actually, how do we sacrifice assets for people? If you have about $1 million, when you sacrifice about, when you donate about $100, those are small amount. But the total amount of assets that you have, normally what wakaf, the timing of the wakaf is actually when somebody who is very rich, and when he pass away. So before passing away, he will have a will or things like that to donate the land and building for charitable purposes. Yeah.
I see. So in a way, I think it's a mind shift change, because I think we should also try to think about what exactly are items that should be considered as public goods that are actually good for the public benefit. Yes. And perhaps if the government can also help to identify and encourage private citizens and the public to join in the action. So one thing that we see on the COVID-19, for example, is the lack of masks and the lack of PPE equipment. Right. And you have sort of civilians all gathering together and building momentum to try and ensure that target is being met.
Ihan, one more thing.
Sure.
Last year's when tabling of the 2020 budget, wakaf was presented as one, I think if not mistaken, it's under section 4411C of the Income Tax Act. So wakaf has been introduced into the act as a means, as an economic instrument in terms of helping the people.
My question is whether do we as the asset holders, do we actually have that appetite for now? Because in a way everybody is trying to save fire. So that is the very important.
Correct.
Yeah.
There are a lot of good rich people here.
and on a very most sort of specific question for you in terms of taxation.
Yeah.
I mean, to raise revenue to fund more programs, one of the most straightforward points that that comes to mind is in the form of taxation. So with only real property gains sort of tax in Malaysia at present, what is your view on the wide-ranging sort of wealth tax that would also have the effect of putting in more money into the government's coffer, but at the same time also mitigating inequality per se?
Yeah, you see, for the past about 1 or 2 years ago, what the government has done is actually to increase the rate, the personal tax rate for the higher income earners. You know, until now, I think last year it was increased to about 30%. If I'm not mistaken, in 2016, 2017, the highest tax rate, marginal tax rate for individual was about 24 to 25%. So it has been increased to about 28%, and last year another to 30%. So what the government is doing is actually to get it more progressive in terms of taxing the rich and helping the poor. But the government has not introduced the wealth tax in terms of capital gains tax, and but we have RPGT, the real property gains tax, which the rate is quite high in terms of if you sell the disposal the assets within 2 years, it's about 30%. And I think last 2 years, when normally those years when you have an asset and when you dispose it after 6 years, there will be no RPGT. But I think last 2 years, the government has introduced, there'll be an RPGT even after 6 years. I think if not mistaken, for companies about 10%, and for individuals about 5%. So I think what the government is doing is gradually taxing the rich people to make it more progressive in terms of more fair. And we know, of course, tax is actually an economic instrument, and it can easily influence the economy. I'll give you an example, like those days that we, the OKUs, when they were unable to get jobs. So what the government does is actually, to get these OKUs to be employed, what the government introduced was, whatever salary paid by companies to these OKUs, by getting them as your employee, they will be given double deduction in terms of salary paid. Meaning, if you pay the OKUs monthly of about $2,000, you can claim $4,000 in terms of your tax benefit. So these are some of the things that the government has been doing, using tax as an economic instrument to influence the economy. And yesterday, as we know, under the economic recovery plan, the short-term economic recovery plan, there were a lot of tax incentive and tax cuts by the government. So I think we are on the right track in terms of getting the business community to be ready and to groom them back in terms of creating revenue and generating profit. One very good example is the rebate. When a PKS and SMEs, when you incorporate a company, when you start off a company starting from July, if I'm not mistaken, to 31st December, they'll give a 20,000 rebate to these companies. So meaning that the government is trying to encourage people, especially the micro business, using digitalized platform to set up companies, corporate entities, to make it legal and to be registered with Lembaga Hasil to earn the 20% rebate. So what the government is doing basically is actually to broaden the tax base in terms of generating or creating companies that into the digital world, in terms of digital marketing, and formalizing this so-called shadow economy or the hidden economy in terms of doing business and not paying tax. So to lift them up and then to get them to be registered, at the same time giving rebate to these people and to contribute to the government.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dato Aziz, for your views. I think what you said there is basically that in order to broaden the tax base, the government has come up with a lot of different initiatives, etc., etc. And I suppose, and this is the key. This is the key, which I think that the economic instruments are there, but ultimately businesses and people have to take it up. And obviously, that is also another question whereby do they have the means? Do they actually want to? Are they capable to? And are they ready for it if these items are there? So previously, even with a lot of the relief funds in the previous 2 stimulus package, I seem to recall that on the news there are a lot of comments about these reliefs are all good, but I'm not taking up because I can't take up the wage subsidy program. I can't do this, I can't do that. So that is also one question. But let's move on from here. Thank you very much, Dato, for your views. Let's move on quickly. I think I would like to next invite our second speaker, Mr. Ravi. Ravi is the National Council member of MCCC and the Executive Director of Sage 3 Sendirian Berhad, a corporate advisory firm. Ravi, if I may put the floor to you, I know you've came out in your report a very interesting concept about rethinking economics and how we should view the current situation and how we should rethink the dynamics of the economic and how government should actually view this as well. So I would put the floor across to you. You have about 10 to 15 minutes.
Good morning, selamat pagi and Zhao Shang Hao to everybody. Thank you very much for giving me the floor. Well, some of the ideas I'm going to share with the participants today are not mainstream. It's a whole concept of a whole phenomenon going around the world called rethinking economics, and Sage 3 has been at the forefront of writing about this new phenomena. But I just want everybody to keep an open mind. We can all learn from each other. So the idea is to have a discourse, and that's, I suppose, the purpose of these webinars. But, you know, the question that you put forward was, you know, is this, you know, this issue of safety net, is, you know, and the funding of safety net. Maybe let's go back to a fundamental question about safety nets itself. And some people, you know, question whether you do need a safety net. So let's just go back a little. Give me a second. I'll get this these things going. 1 second. Yeah. Okay. I think the first question is, you know, do we really need the safety net? Some people think it's not, but just look what's going on in America. You've got all these riots taking place at the moment. Now that's, you know, people want to enjoy, you know, if you don't get the safety net correct, it's not just from a humane perspective, it's also important from a societal perspective and economic perspective that we get the safety net sorted out. Just go back to the Asian crisis, and we go back to the Asian crisis. The one thing that we know Malaysia got right in the crisis that actually helped a lot was there were no riots in the streets. There was a little bit of issues around reformasi, but really parliament worked. The whole streets were okay. Economy can take place. What we don't want is, we don't want a situation where we've got riots in the streets. And somebody actually coined a funny word, said it's like revolution insurance. So best we take out this revolution insurance and ensure it's well funded. So I think if there is any doubt for amongst the rich amongst the participants, we talked about taxing the rich a little more. For the ones who are rich, you know, if you think, oh God, you're giving all these poor people money, trust me, it's worth it. It's like, consider it's like revolution insurance. You want to sip lattes in Bangsa Shopping Center, Atamas, Monkiara, and so on. You want your streets to be safe and sound. So this is the first thing we need to think. Yes, it is absolutely critical that we get the safety net working correctly. So that's the first point I was trying to make, is just that we need to make sure that safety net is in place. The next point we want to go to is a little bit about, yes, the government's been giving out handouts. That's all very well and good, and that's something we have to do to make sure things are going well. I'm not qualified to speak on how far those handouts have reached and is everybody covered, but that's important. People need to be covered. And we need, for the points I said earlier, that we need to make sure that the society is stable and there's, you know, no riots and so on. So it's important that the weakest in society is actually protected. But one of the things that I'm going to now start is talk a little bit about rethinking economics. And the two professors who lead the world in, two professors that I've read about, and I think make a lot of good sense, is one is Professor Mazzucato, and another professor that we looked at is Professor Stephanie Carlton. And I'll talk about a couple of things and questions that they have raised. Now, the first one is Stephanie Carlton. That's a picture of her, and she's written a book called Deficit Myth. And she raises a very good question: who is the best place to borrow? And that's something I will come back and talk about as I go through the presentation. The other thing is, how does the government spending affect private sector savings? And that's another thing. We don't see this spoken much about in terms of macroeconomics. Just one moment, I just need to power up my computer. Just give me a second, yeah? I'm sorry about that, everybody. The computer's back. So the next question is, what happens to government savings and how does it affect private sector savings? And I'll actually take you through that, and that will probably give you a different light on things. The one that's really interesting, and in fact, in the large budget, I think a lot of people are starting to rethink the issue of the state and how does the state play in terms of helping things out. And it's not the conventional wisdom that the private sector is efficient and the state is absolutely inefficient and useless. So this has been some of the things that Professor Mazzucato has spoken about. So one of the things that I said I will talk about, who is best placed to borrow? Now, sometimes policymakers think, oh God, it's a recession. Best time is to tighten the belt and then tighten budget. Of course, that's simply the wrong thing to do. In terms of, we really need to think is, there's no question about how we can afford it or not. That's the wrong question to ask, is what we need to do, and we need to get around doing that. So the first thing is, unlike households and the businesses, the government owns the central bank. So here in Malaysia, we are lucky we have the ringgit is our currency. It's issued by the Bank Negara Malaysia, and therefore we can issue currency. Yeah? Of course, there are two downsides about issuing currency. One is the issue of inflation. The other one is potential risk to the exchange rate. So other than countries like in the US during the Great Depression, where they had to peg their currency against the US dollar, against gold, they couldn't issue new money, then there's a problem. Or even in Eurozone, where they can't actually issue their own money, they're dependent on the central bank, the European Central Bank. We actually have huge flexibility in terms of how we manage our economy. So in terms of inflation, I think one of the things that we need to take in mind, inflation has been benign. And in fact, actually in a lot of the sectors in the economy, even before this pandemic, there's already overcapacity. So if the government was to stimulate parts of the economy, I don't see inflation taking place. Yeah, and certainly it's not a major issue. The other issue that I think is we always consider is that are we going to see a run on the ringgit if this government deficit goes up? Now, one of the issues that we can talk about safely, except the last month, we continue to run a strong trade surplus. This is not the issues in 97 or 96 when we're running a huge deficit. We run a trade surplus, and I wouldn't be, maybe I don't know what happened last month. Obviously, this is unusual circumstances, but generally on the underlying economy, we run a trade surplus. So again, on that side, the risk is actually mitigated. Now, also, I think one of the concerns has been, what about the rating agencies? On that score, perhaps one of the things that we need to consider is in 1998, I was with the government, and no one really cared about the rating agencies. We were one notch above junk. Had we followed IMF and the World Bank, we've been suffering like our neighboring countries for 10 years. So that was certainly never an issue. The government has to do whatever is necessary to solve the national issue. It's not about what the rating agency says. But I think the other thing that I think we can take comfort in this crisis is every government in the world is ballooning their deficit. So I think there's no issue about spending. We have to spend, and we must make sure the spending is done in such a way that it helps the economy to recover. So, but still on this issue of the deficit, and this is the one point that I think we want to get a little bit more clarity about. Now, it's not only at this point in time, as long as the government is, I think Dato also spoke about earlier, if the government is doing things that is actually increasing the economy or making things better, the moonshot ideas and so on that Professor Mazzucato said, things that really can shift the economy, then actually the government plays a huge role. And it's not just in the United States or where they funded DARPA and things funded. Even if you think back to Malaysia, who funded the palm oil estates in Malaysia? Who brought rubber to Malaysia? It was actually brought through a government initiative. They were not brought by the private sector. It was actually done through a government initiative. So government plays an important role in the economy. They can play a huge leadership role. But let's put it this way. But the real thing is everybody is so concerned about, what about government deficit? Now, one of the things I think, just to pick on what Prof. Dato said earlier, is that there is a budget deficit and it's a number which is in parliament. Still, the rule of law is important. So I think if you're going to breach it, then, it's incumbent on the government of the day to make sure that the laws are changed, etc. To enable it. It should follow the law. Rule of law is important. So if the government it's not good if the government breaks its own laws. So I think that's one thing they have to look at, how to actually expand the deficit if necessary. Yeah? But this slide here is extremely telling, because on one side, on the red, you actually see the government deficit. On the blue is the government savings. And it's simple double entry. On one side, when the government spends, the opposite side is the money goes to the public, the savings, the households, the businesses. And so the government spending is actually mirrored by the private sector saving. We'll talk about external sector later date, but generally this is what happens. So why would anybody be so concerned about private sector savings instead of saying, oh, we're worried about government deficit? Are you so concerned that the private sector is getting wealthier? Of course, there's an issue of distribution. But what is wrong if the private sector is getting richer? And we pointed out earlier, the people that can borrow in this time is actually the government. And in fact, I think John Maynard Keynes said that, the right time for the Treasury to increase the deficit, or rein in the deficit is in a boom. Certainly in a bust like this, or in particular in a crisis, is absolutely important the government starts spending. So I think these are some of the concepts. I don't have a lot of time to speak about it, but just trying to get some of the flavor of the concepts on the role of government, the role of deficits, which can actually help us come out of this crisis. The next point I would like to talk about is, again, if you don't buy generally into the idea of governments, should be interventionist, and you have a very conservative right-wing approach to life, and say businesses must run anything. But in a crisis, I think there is no question the government has to intervene. This model, which you can see on the slide up there, is the one that was used by the government in 1998 during the Asian financial crisis. It's a well-coordinated approach. Again, the government takes the lead, coordinates everything. It's no different even if you think during the emergency, during the emergency against the communists. Again, it's always a government-initiated, coordinated approach, written from the top-down approach. So again, this is a model which works. Now, the issue about, if you look at this, is this crisis is obviously far broader than the crisis which we faced in 1998. So the government's approach is a lot of it, yes, we've seen all the stimulus, but actually a lot of the effort is actually coming through the banking sector, which has the network to get the money into businesses quickly. Now, when we talk about the safety net, it's not just talking about direct funding to obviously to make sure people have a roof and food on the table. But I think the critical part is how do we save jobs? And this model in 1998 worked very well because through restructuring, the number of businesses that actually collapsed was somehow mitigated. And now the idea is how do we do that this time? But the problem on this time is it's not just the demand side. The government can't just solve the demand side. And really, we need to talk about the supply side as well. And again, it's government can, even in a capitalist economy, the government can actually intervene on the supply side. And a good example of that is during the Second World War. What you can see there's a picture of two fighter planes the British used during the Second World War, the Hurricane and the Spitfire. And what the UK government did was they actually coordinated the production of the fighter plane. So by the time the Battle of Britain took place, what was interesting is Britain had more planes at the end of the battle, despite the losses, and produced far more planes than Germany did during that period. Again, during short periods of time and selectively, the government can actually affect both the supply side and the demand side. Now, that's the only way I believe we can actually get employment back quickly to new sectors. We're going to wait for private sectors, licensing, funding, etc. It just take too long, and the suffering will be, outrageous. So what we are suggesting is a much greater role for the government in this crisis, and don't worry about the funding. I think even the people like Reinhard and Raghav finally said the last round. If you looked at the article in the Age on the interview, they suggested it's almost like times of war. Nobody actually talks about deficits at times of war. It's also the same in this situation. We want to stop the suffering. The government has to spend. It has a central bank, and it should make use of it to actually fund the deficit and the safety net. So just to summarize quickly, I think the safety net is absolutely important. It's critical for economic stability, and we need to do it. Second point is it's all about deficit spending. Taxes and all at this stage is not possible. Income tax, people have lost jobs, companies are in difficulties. it's always going to be impossible. You can't introduce a new tax at this stage. Yeah. So it is about deficit spending, and you got to spend enough to get the GDP up. We can talk about how much should you spend and how you think about that spending. The other thing is saving businesses is critical to the whole thing, because saving businesses is saving jobs, which equals the safety net. And the fourth point is a command and control structure the government needs to put in place. 3 layers. This should come out in the Age, I think, in the next week or so. There should be a long article on talking about how the command and control structure should be coordinating at the business level, the banking level, and the special purpose vehicles the government needs to put in place, or the government of agencies, and how they all three interact to ensure that the businesses do not collapse, jobs are done, and the government economy is stimulated. I think I've covered a lot, Ihan, in a short period of time. I mean, happy to take questions later on this issue, and so hopefully we can have a good discourse, because I think it's the first time we've actually had a chance to actually talk about rethinking economics in a public webinar or public seminar. So, and we got a very, very great professor around, and I'm sure that yourself, I hope to actually have a good discourse in the next few minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ravi. I think that was a very interesting points that you mentioned there. If I may just throw in a question before I move on to Prof. Wu. So you talk about Stephanie Kelton and Matsukato and economists who are very progressive in thinking how we should relook at this. So I think they have both mostly been looking at developed economies. So Stephanie Kelton, who's a major advocacy for the MMT, for the modern monetary theory, she mainly relies on borrowing and printing money from the central bank and to fund all that. And Mariama Matsukato's model of this mission-oriented innovation that you were talking about, where I think that the main key is that the state can harness the private sector to come up with innovative solutions for the big problems of our time. So we're also talking about a whole society approach. Now, do you think their thinking applies readily to Malaysia? Because are there any differences that we need to take into account? You mentioned a lot of similarities as well, but what are the differences that we need to be mindful of and
Okay, I think one of the best economists, I forget his name, who talked about quantitative techniques, he actually tells you to look back at economic history, because all our discussions or our opinions can come from that. At least it's a starting point of good discussion. So if you look back at 2008, both China and the United States faced an economic crisis. Yeah? Obviously, Bernanke, knowing supposed to be an expert in the Great Depression, he went and made sure, of course, the mistakes of 1929 were not repeated. The bank's liquidity was pumped in. China did the same, plus, I say. They did the same, but they also stimulated the economy. They actually exploded the balance sheets. Yeah. You look at it, China actually exploded the balance sheet. Look where China is 10 years later. Even if they had a recession, took off minus 10%, what would it do? Yeah? It actually transformed China during that period. So again, government-led. Okay, I mean, there's freedoms and other things are another discussion. But if you're thinking about government-led, and if you're talking about most countries, even I know one of my relatives was in EPU a long time ago, when we look at the Lookie's policy and so on, the countries that rapidly grow, obviously, for fast growth during a burst of period, of course you lose innovation and all in the long term, but the role of government is absolutely critical. I think in Malaysia's case, I think we've always had strong use of the ringgit. I mean, until we've tried, we won't know. I suppose that's unfortunate. But if you ask me now, inflation is not a major issue. Exchange rate is not an issue. Even if you have to control currency a little bit to make sure exchange rate is maintained, I see that's a good thing to get us out of a problem. Because the alternative of the whole economy and people suffering is just unacceptable.
Agree. And we can talk a little bit more about sort of these questions later after Prof. Wu also share with us his view. And thank you very much, Ravi, for your short presentation. I would like to move on, last but not least, move on and invite Prof. Wu to share with us his insights. Prof, you are the president of Jeffrey Chia Institute on Southeast Asia and director of Jeffrey Sachs Center on Sustainable Development in Sunway University. And he's also a distinguished professor of economics at the University of California in Davis, United States. So thank you very much for dialing in all the way from the US. I hope you are doing fine. And if I may, I'll pass the floor to you for the next 10 to 15 minutes. You need to unmute yourself, Prof.
Yes. Good morning. Thank you, Yihan, for including me in this panel. I'm most grateful to the Malaysia-China Chamber of Commerce for giving me this opportunity to report some of the conclusions on research that is being done at Sunway University on how to generate a high rate of socio-economic development and how to keep that high rate resilient to shocks. This research agenda within the academic community is called the Sustainable Development Research Agenda. At Sunway, we're more practical. We call it the Health and Wealth Research Agenda. And the health and wealth agenda has always been important, which is why the Sunway Medical Center is an important component of the Sunway Group and possibly the fastest growing component of the Sunway Group. In the health and wealth research agenda, we see two kinds of safety nets. We find two kinds of nets. The first net is the safety net, and the second one is the prevention net. The safety net is how to make things better after disaster has occurred. The prevention net is how do we catch a shock that is coming to prevent it from creating disaster in the first place, or at least lessen the impact of that shock. So let me apply this dual approach of prevention net and safety net to the discussion of COVID-19. COVID-19 is an awfully contagious disease. Because it is so easy to transmit, COVID-19 is a global problem, not something that that Malaysia can solve. The best response by Malaysia is contingent on the actions that other countries are taking. And what are these actions that we need to think about in solving the COVID-19 problem, especially a reoccurrence of infectious diseases like this in the future? Well, there are three sets of actions: global level set of actions, regional level set of actions, and the internal national actions. I will argue that the more effective the global sets of actions, the less we will need regional level sets of actions. But unfortunately, in this time where the United States under Donald Trump is actively sabotaging multilateral cooperation on almost every front, be it climate change, weapon proliferation, NATO, world trade, or world health, we have to come up with a stronger set of regional level set of actions to compensate for the reduced amount of global level actions. I will have more to, this is certainly the right forum to bring it up, because after all, this is the Malaysia-China Chamber of Commerce. It is where the regional economies have a big role to play. Well, let me quickly go over what the main global level set of actions is. The first one is that we got to have an agreement where every country must report the occurrence of infectious diseases to WHO in a timely fashion, and to actively keep the WTO updated on the developing situation within its borders. Second set of actions is what the WHO will play two kinds of role. One role is information coordination role, and whereby the WHO will collect the information and propagate it to its membership. The second one is the advisory function, whereby it advises the countries that have less strong health management capabilities on how to react to the new infections that are appearing. The third set of global actions are actually done individually. It's the setting up of a dense network of direct communication between the CDCs of the major of the world, and a network communication amongst the leading medical research centers of the world. The major item to be funded here is the WHO. And I think that funding should be done according to one, the absolute size, the absolute GDP of the country, and second, the GDP per capita of a country. In other words, India pays more because it is such a big chunk of the global economy, so it has a lot to lose, but because of its low GDP per capita, its ability to contribute is lower. So we need to have a balance between these two variables. And on the national level actions, I think we can give Malaysia a pat on its back. Malaysia, we have done very well if you look at the mess that is in the United States and the United Kingdom. After all, Mahathir, who is no popular supporter of the present government, has acknowledged that the COVID-19 effort has been done very well in this country. So this is something that is beyond dispute. Well, what are the three things that I think we need to strengthen within Malaysia and which we need to finance? The first one is clearly we got to strengthen the system of monitoring and tracking. We got to be able to have adequate testing so that we know what is happening. And the other one has to do with the ability to trace. And thanks to the widespread ownership of smartphones, I think tracing has been made a lot easier. And since we have got a comprehensive network of government clinics in the urban and rural area, we have the capability to do very good tracking, especially if awareness level is raised. The second set of measures is the strengthening of the Malaysian medical system, whereby both the private sector and the public hospitals can play complementary roles. There are things that now that in retrospect is quite clear what needs to be stocked up. We got to have adequate inventory of protective equipment. We got to have the capacity to be able to scale up the number of beds in infectious wards. And the third is certainly to be able to conduct a measure of frontier research at our local medical universities. The third part, which this panel has been focusing on, is the strengthening of emergency economic relief programs, the safety net. I think that one thing we do know is the cost of these programs are lower if the global level actions are highly successful, because the global level actions basically is the prevention net, part of a strong part of the prevention net. And what the government has done, as Mahathir has acknowledged, has been a very good job. And the funding of it, the best funding is a revived economy. But it has to be safe to open up economic transactions once more. And the sooner you can open up, the easier it is to finance all this social safety net. So the smaller the outbreak in the first place, in other words, if we were able to contain it at the very early stage through the monitoring and surveillance a mechanism, we would certainly be able to have much lower costs and open earlier. Dato Aziz and Mr. Navaratnam have given us very good suggestions on how we should think about funding the safety net. Dr. Aziz has given very specific suggestions, like the National Economy and Social Safety Net Fund. And Mr. Navaratnam tells us, don't worry about the deficit immediately. In other words, don't be scared by the rating agencies who are a bunch of check the box bureaucrats. You know, you got to look at the situation and save the life first, and then we can, because once with the elimination of the disease and having kept the firms alive, that makes the rebound a lot easier. That is all true. I think I definitely second Dato Aziz's recommendation that the revenue raising capacity of the government should be increased. The GST certainly increased the revenue raising capability of the government. It unfortunately has the property of being particularly hard on the lower income. In other words, if you look at the amount of taxes they pay through GST as a proportion of income, the lower your income, the higher the tax rate. So it doesn't mean that's, I presume, why it was so disliked. But I think that it would be nice to broaden it further by increasing what Dato Aziz has identified, taxes on items like capital gains in the stock market, and about earnings on bank deposits. I think these are measures that Malaysia could resort to and should resort to in order to strengthen the three systems I talk about: the surveillance, tracking and monitoring system, the medical system, and the emergency economic relief programs. Let me now talk about the part that is particularly salient to us right now because of Donald Trump's irresponsibility towards the global community. Well, to the US. He's particularly irresponsible to US voters. It is not just to the global community, he's screwing everybody. Now, so what we really need to talk about is regional level actions. Malaysia is very dependent on tourism. And a large proportion of our tourists comes from neighboring countries. So what we really need to do is to establish a health protocol whereby people are tested before they get on the plane. Let's say a week before, 14 days before. That is something that medical experts can decide on. They're tested upon landing. And if both tests show that they are free of the virus, we can do without the quarantine period. It's only without the quarantine period can we safely reopen. Can the tourism industry be revived adequately? And we want to do it safely. So there has to be a regional protocol on how you handle travel during a time of pandemic in the region. Then the other part, which is already financed but need to be reoriented, is the BRI program. The BRI program for Malaysia has been railroads. That's one thing we all know well. But I think that if that's going to be the reorientation, how about hospitals? I think it is just as important an infrastructure as transportation and power plants. So I think that if we can work together to make the BRI investments that China has committed itself to doing, part of it should now be retaught in light of the COVID-19 experience. Medical assistance, I think, should be a key component of the BRI work. And if we are able to work together successfully, if ASEAN and China are able to work successfully on the different fronts of BRI, I think we are more likely to be able to work successfully on the issues generated by the 9-dash line in the South China Sea. And this is certainly something that the Malaysia-China Chamber of Commerce must no doubt recognizes as a key issue between the two countries. So that's what I'll say for the moment, and I would like to hear what my fellow panelists and members of the audience comments.
Thank you very much, Prof. I think that gives us a very overall and lots more food for thought. And we have about the next, I would say, 15 to 20 minutes to try and sort of engage in a little bit more of discussion. Before I throw in a couple of questions, I thought one point that perhaps Prof can give us a bit of insight into is you talked a bit about in terms of foreign investments to develop local infrastructures such as the railways, and you throw in also on other infrastructure, which is very important now, like hospitals and as such. Surely this could be an avenue for us to consider to boost our economy. But I just want to ask on a bit of a longer term economic impact, for example, on the Northeast Asia, where they actually did better in terms of managing this pandemic than the West. Will that actually accelerate any rebalancing in the region?
I think the acceleration in the region is not just due to the better performance in handling the COVID-19, but also due to this blowing up of the global order by Mr. Trump. Basically, he's doing it more to change the global attitude towards the role of America in the future than than what's happening on the ground. Yes, that is no doubt. We know that there are changes going on, which Malaysia potentially. The trouble is the economic case for gains is so clear, but the only trouble is the concern for national security, especially because of the competition between the US and China, may make it difficult for us to reap the economic benefits that are there. Specifically, how can ASEAN stay together as an integrated entity? Or are we going to become pawns in a bigger game beyond disease? Because how is the disease being spun? The disease is, my first naive thought was, great, we have got this disaster. The US and China got to work together to contain the disaster. It's a no-brainer, right? There's a fire, so both of us go put out the fire together. But instead, one side look at the other and say, why did you allow the fire to begin in the first place? And you should compensate us for the losses. But this is all gets us nowhere. Because after all, the 1929 global crisis, the 2008 global crisis originated on Wall Street, New York City. And what has the US done to compensate? You know, once you talk about you need to compensate for me or this and that, the answer is whatever happened in the past is past. But what we need to do is let's get rich and healthy together. That's the key. And unfortunately, for his own election, Donald Trump has gone against what I thought to be the obvious thing. Work together and solve the problem. And instead, he has gone on to withdraw funding from WHO. That's incredible. This is the first line of defense. That's the prevention net. He's weakening the prevention net. You know, it's almost like the only nets I can think of now is the nets at the basketball hoop. The world is becoming a basket case thanks to his removal of the prevention net.
I can see that Dato Aziz has something to share. Please do. I think this is an open session, so we can just chip in as we like. Yeah.
All right, Prof. I just would like to reconfirm. Are you still in US?
Yes, I am in the US.
You must be very brave talking about Donald Trump.
Well, because I think the good news is his days are numbered. His mouth, he has fallen in through his own mouth.
Okay, all right. Okay, may I suggest, Prof, when you talk about the safety net policy and the prevention approach, may I suggest a term you use as the safety harness approach? Okay. Maybe you can make just a simple suggestion. Maybe that is the, when I was looking at safety net, so I came across the word safety harness. I think safety harness is actually more in the preventive measures of yours in terms of restraining or holding a person and preventing a person from falling. It is more attached to the individual rather than the safety net. Safety net, you fall first and you follow the safety net. Harness is actually with you. So meaning like insurance measures, what you were saying about preventive measures, maybe the foundation or the Sunway group can introduce the safety harness policy in terms of economics terms. My humble suggestion to you, Prof. Okay.
Excellent suggestion.
Okay. All right. Can I address, Ihan, the issue on the external debt?
Yes, please
matters?
do. Yeah.
Okay, I saw a chat there. Okay, currently in 2019, in the fiscal economic report, fiscal by the Ministry of Finance, I only have the 2019 figures. The total percentage of domestic debt is about 96%, and the external debt is only about 4%. 4% is about 29 billion. And the domestic debt is about 96%, which is about 770 billion. In all, percentage to GDP, The domestic debt is about 50.7% to GDP. The external debt is about 2% to GDP. So we are not quite worried in terms of, I think Tengku Zafrul has rightly mentioned it. In terms of risk, we are okay because most of our debt are local, domestic debt, and only about 2% of GDP, our debt are external. Okay, that is one on the external debt issue. So not to worry in terms of foreign exchange and currency and all those things. The other question raised, if I think about the this is a bit political question in terms of authorization by the parliament on the spending by the government. If I'm not mistaken, there are some contingency fund or emergency fund within the budget that the government has done. As per last year's budget. If I'm not mistaken, it is in the Prime Minister's office expenditure. There are some contingency fund there. I think they are using this fund or the fund which was money was borrowed by the previous government, which the Minister of Finance has said that I don't know whether the money has came in or not. But in terms of authorization by the parliament for additional budget, in terms of supplementary budget, I think they should formalize or legalize it when the next parliament sitting in July. But for the time being, I think in terms of the amount of spending, additional spending by the government, I think it is still within the contingency fund budget under the Prime Minister's department. Okay, I might be wrong, but maybe we can check it out.
Maybe if I can, right.
Yes, please do, Ravi.
Maybe I can just share a little bit on the external debt. Dato is absolutely correct. The external debt in US dollars is actually very low. It's low. But what is high is the MGS, which is owned by foreigners, right? Malaysian government securities. That's I think substantial. I can't remember the exact number, but it's more than half of the MGS. I think it's owned by a foreigner. So if there is a huge sell down on MGS, then what you will see is an outflow of currency. That means people will sell down the ringgit and take out US dollars. I mean, that's always been a worry. And I think 2008, they had a lot of issues around that. But again, there's no reason, I think like Prof was saying, I think a lot of judgment calls today, there has been capital flows. It's not that there hasn't been capital flows, but a lot of judgment calls now today, if I was investors, how well have you performed against COVID-19 in Malaysia? I think Sunway's come out with something like we're ranked 12th or in the world best in performance in managing COVID. So maybe I don't see that as going to be a problem that people are going to withdraw capital, but who's to say it's all future events? We can't say that for sure. In terms of the government stimulus, if you really look at it carefully, like I actually alluded to the point, it's actually it's coming from the banking sector, okay? So 100 billion was the estimation that if you don't pay down your loans, and that's really crisis economics, right? You don't want debt to be paid down and money supply reduced. So what we've actually done is we've gone back and told a lot of businesses, in fact, you and I enjoy this as well, as mortgage payments don't have to be made and so forth, credit card payments and so on. You actually got a moratorium on that. So that's a large part of that. The other large part was coming through Dana Jamin, and I think now it's been enhanced to SJPP, is the 50 billion ringgit for working capital lines. So there's 20% from the banks and then 80% comes in or whatever, the guarantee fund. So they're all off balance sheet. So the vast majority of that funding is coming off balance sheet. So the government's only on the hook for it in the future if people default on these working capital. And I think going back to Professor Wu's point, if the economy is saved, then these markers aren't going to be called in.
Thank you very much, Ravi, for your comments. Prof, is there anything you would like to add, or should I move along to the next question from our...
Let's see what the audience would like to ask.
Okay. I have a couple here. There is one from KL Tan. I think this question, perhaps Prof has already answered part of it, where we are talking about, I think Tan was saying that opening up tourism and business travel, what is your view or immediate actions on the regional countries to form bubbling as a quick cooperation? I think, Prof, you mentioned a little bit earlier in terms of how we can try to address that. For example, when Thailand tourists coming in, Tanya mentioned about Australia and New Zealand, Malaysia and Southeast Asia. Is there anything you would like to add? Otherwise, I think you have pretty much answered that particular point.
Well, I think if the addressing the health concern, of course, is most important. That's why we have this health protocol. The other thing that could be usefully done to revive the industry is the still very restrictive visa requirements on visitors from China, much more than if you were coming from North Korea, which is quite puzzling to me.
Okay. So shall we move on to the next question? I have one from the chat group where we talk about windfall tax. Perhaps this is something that Dato Aziz, you would like to take on. Should a windfall tax be considered for sectors which have unexpectedly benefited from the pandemic, such as the glove sector, Uber, all the online deliveries that we see are obviously very busy now and busy hiring as well?
It is already in their financial statement because when companies make excessive profits, like the gloves manufacturing companies, the mask companies, it is all in. It is already in. And when computing their profits and doing their tax assessment, they should be paying more tax. When you talk about the online businesses like Grab, not all these entrepreneurs, meaning like doing online business, not all are registered with the Lembaga Hasil Dalam Negeri. So that is how what the government has been doing now is actually to get these people to come into the net, to come into the tax net, so that they can tax these people, meaning the online entrepreneurs to pay their fair share amount of tax. Because in tax, we have social justice. We cannot be, a person who is working so hard and paying tax, and you have the other person who is, enjoying life and not paying tax. So it is unfair. So in terms of social justice, social tax policy, whatever the amount if you make, you should pay a fair amount of tax if you are making profit. So coming back to the windfall tax, that is already in the system. When they make higher profits, they pay more tax. Thank you.
I see. Thank you very much. We have another. Sorry, does any speaker would like to add on to that, or no? I have another question here. I think that could perhaps be something that Ravi may be interested in answering. It's the last one. Yes, sorry. Yes.
I just remembered.
Yes.
So many years ago, we have this excess profit tax. I think this is, I think this might be the question, because when you make excessive profits, I can't remember, it was so many years ago when companies make excessive profit, they have this excess profit tax. I don't think this is the right time to do it because our tax rate is quite okay in terms of 24%. I think for the time being, when they register more profit, more taxable income, they should be able to pay more tax. I think it should be okay. Good.
I think the question of windfall tax is the solution of defining excessive profits is a difficult one.
Yeah.
What we should have is to keep the progressiveness that is in the tax system.
Yeah.
In other words, the marginal tax rate goes up as income goes up. So it's automatic instead of specially passing a windfall tax, because it could easily become political victimization. I don't like your face. You donated to the wrong party, and so here's a windfall tax for you. So this, I think, the progressiveness of the tax system and the widening of the base, like the tax on capital gains, in particular.
That's certainly something worth considering, because I think other countries were also doing it, even in the UK, where actually I practiced as a tax practitioner in UK for 7 years, Dato, while in the UK with Deloitte. But it has been it's quite a while since then. And Malaysia, I think it has been quite we have been quite relaxed in a way in terms of the categories of taxes that we have. Perhaps this is a time to think about it again, whether is this the right time to implement and how much we can gather in terms of revenue. I think remains to be seen given the current situation. If we moved on, I think Ravi, a question for you. I think you mentioned earlier about the off-balance sheet items as we were talking about the debts. The question here is, what are the risks Perhaps you can expand a little bit and share your views on that.
Thanks, Ihan. Just on this one, I think there's quite a few things you can ask. Now, the first one is the big ones which I'm more familiar is on the banking side risk, yeah? And I'll talk a little bit about that. Now, one of the things that, you know, if all these liabilities are going to crystallize, is like Prof said quite rightly, how well the economy recovers, right? So if you go back to 1998, the government took on a huge contingent liability. Actually, what's not known to many of y'all is the government actually guaranteed all deposits at one point, and the government actually guaranteed all deposits. It never crystallized. And if you look at the measures the government did in 1998 during the Asian crisis, they underwrote the Dana Harta bonds and all that money. In the end, the whole thing never even cost the government more than 4% because we had the V-shaped recovery, right? So it's a function of how well you do that. So now we've put in, you know, you've actually put in 50 odd billion at risk. The other 100 billion is, you know, the banks one is squarely sitting in the banks, yeah? There's no risk to the government, and some of the stimulus which you talked about, EPF, borrowing on EPF and all that, it's not coming out of government budget, but then on the other hand, the government's not on the hook for it, yeah? So people spend on from EPF money and all that, government's on the hook. So there are some of these guarantees which the government will be on the hook for. The last round during the GFC, I think there was some 7 billion or so which was given out quickly, or 700 million, sorry, I think was one through a banking scheme. And that one was, I think there was some issues because the banks quickly ran to give out the money and the government was on the hook for it. And they just lent sillily. And I think China as well, there's some issues around that. And then basically government ended up on the hook, and ProHas is now, you know, trying to collect it back for donkeys years later. So it is important. So one of the issues I understand that's obviously the issue now on this 50 billion is what's the process for the claim on the government? Yeah? So the banks lend out because the money is actually coming from the bank. Then the government is underwriting the risk. And how do you get that process right? So again, that process is important, but in my humble opinion, I think the money needs to get out quickly. Speed is actually the more important criteria at this time. The government has to take on the risk. Even if it crystallizes, it's a price worth paying.
On that note, can I bring sort of the discussion into what, in fact, REFSA has been also looking at in terms of research and ideas, is the role of the state has sort of become more and more apparent, and more discussion surrounding it. Certainly, like Mariana Mazzucato was talking about, in a sense that the state has a key role to play. And to a lot of extent, if I may share, I partly felt that for us and for REFSA's economic sort of philosophy, the state should play a couple of roles, apart from as a regulator ensuring that the market is functioning well. It may also need to intervene, as you say, during the global financial crisis, when the results are not sort of aligned with the societal choices. For example, now where this pandemic has wiped out a lot of people's livelihoods. The other thing that we talked about is also on as the state as an innovator, that we should perhaps think about putting in place industrial policies to promote certain growth sectors. Do you think the government should sort of start looking into that now, an active industrial policy where they can support and push for the sectors to reorient the economy? When we talk about certain sectors, I think Prof. Wu mentioned about renewable energies, looking at sectors that helps on what do you call sustainable and solving climate change. We are looking at agri-food, where we are talking about the security of food. It becomes very, very important. We are talking about healthcare systems, and from government's sort of approach or effort on it, jobs will also be created. So shaping new growth sectors and putting in a huge amount of financial might and strength into it, on the assumption that, as Ravi was saying, that you don't really have to worry about debt, and you don't have to, all these things need to take a back seat, because the situation where we are in is that is unprecedented. There's not really any history or examples that you can base on. Perhaps I think this is a question for all three speakers, if we can sort of have some views on how the government should play a key role. And I think it's very important because Prof. mentioned that you have this global effort and a regional effort and national effort. So if we zoom in on Malaysia's national effort, what are the key things that we should look at now in terms of job creation, in terms of livelihood, in terms of ensuring that the economy can keep going?
Let me take the risk of starting, and so that the others can amend things as I say. I am a strong enthusiast of industrial policy, but I'm also conscious of that in Asia, there are 3 countries that have used industrial policies and done very well: Japan, South Korea, Taiwan. But there have been many examples where industrial policy have bankrupted the country. So the first thing we have to do is we have to find out the industrial policies we have done so far. Why have they not succeeded spectacularly? Why has Pervaja not succeeded spectacularly? Why has all the high-com industries not done so well in the past? Until we can figure out where we went wrong, we should be careful. I think that instruments are circumstance specific. Is it because the lack of training in our civil servants? That's why they didn't implement it correctly. If that was what it is, then we know what to do. Or is it because they were instruments of political patronage, which led to the disaster? Then we know what to do. So basically, we have to avoid the mistakes of the past and not make new ones in the future. It is true that I promote industrial policies exactly I say what the US needs, but because I have confidence that an objective set of criteria could be developed and implemented. For example, if it loses money continually, you just have to say, you know, we have to write off this, we have to write it off this investment and move on. But the hardest thing to do for any government is to say, hey, I make a mistake. Because if you make a mistake, why are you still there? So no government would ever find it easy to to admit I screwed up. So that is what we need. The big issue is, why did we not do well during the period when we had so much money from Petronas to do so many projects? Why did we fail? That is what I think we need to answer. The Japanese have lots of bad projects you can identify. So can the South Koreans, so can the Taiwanese. But they were able to stop the financial hemorrhaging of these failed projects. You know, it's just like different children have different capabilities. And for some reason, so we should support them differently. So this is where we have, and since this is a new government in power, so this government is not indebted to whatever failed policies in the past. So they could do an objective assessment of why some of the things have not shown up in the past. This is not a matter of blaming who make it fail or so forth. It's a matter of what could we do better in our institutional incentives to produce better outcome.
Thanks, Prof. Thank you. Thank you. Ravi and Dato, if any of you would like to chip in.
Maybe I can just share a little bit about.
Yes, please. Yeah.
Prof spoke about Pervaja, and in fact, I was involved in the final restructuring and then some of the oil steel sector. Now, one of the things that you actually look back, and this is you talk about HICOM and policies by Tunem, early 80s, old enough so you can remember that. One of the things that I actually observed, or at least we've been observing, writing about it, is if you compare South Korea and so on, okay, they had a closed economy for cars, right? They absolutely had a closed economy for cars. But there's at least local competition, strong local competition. Here we had only one player making one car. So again, it's complete monopoly. So some of it has probably, I mean, political and all will be the first things that everybody will jump up and shout in Malaysia. But one of the, just moving on the rhetoric, at least one observation you could see is there was absolutely no competition. Yeah. In South Korea, at least there were 3 or 4 producers. Some were actually closed down during the Asian crisis and so forth. So that's some of the reasons why we didn't work. But Malaysia has got a mixed bag of results as well. If you look at state-owned enterprise and all, arguably Petronas has done very, very well. Yeah, you got arguably Petronas has done very well as a global corporation, and so it's one of the top.
Oil companies don't do well.
Yeah. Okay, it's not an environmental issue, but it's certainly in terms of what it's done and developed in a way, still better than you can compare against with Indonesia. That's not the benchmark, but again, national oil companies, Petronas ranks fairly well. If you talk about government industrial policy or policies that did well, it's not necessarily perfect, but if you ask me, the multimedia super corridor is a good example. We obviously didn't create the Silicon Valley in East Malaysia, but if you look at it, you've had growth of a lot of other parts of the industry like data centers, call centers, and finally you've got people like HP, Roche, and all actually now having their main programming in Malaysia. So this is a high value industry finally getting there. But if we hadn't done what we had done in the 90s, we won't be even here. So I think there is a role for government. So sometimes it works, sometimes. I gave you plantations as an example of it. People might disagree, but plantations is a great example. But again, it's not run completely by the government or one company. So today we got very large, in terms of tropical plantations, we're one of the leaders in the world.
Okay, Ihan. Okay, like rightfully put it, Mr. Ravi, I think it all boils down to timing. Timing is a very important matter when we do industrial policy. I remember 20, 30 years ago when we started off Proton, for example. At that time, we wanted a Malaysian car. So it is actually a heavy industrialization program. It has to be selected industry. For example, now under the COVID situation, so we need to focus on the tourism industry, for example. And then now what we have to do is the digital industry, for example, bringing in Alibaba and then digitalize and bringing in the, I think yesterday was, there was something about the OHQ, bringing in the HQ headquarters in Malaysia and getting about 10 years or 15 years tax-free, tax haven, a 0% tax rate. So it's actually bringing in these people to come in and invest in Malaysia, but using the platform of the digital industry. It depends, the industry policy depends on timing. What we should do at that time, 20, 30 years ago, is actually to build the heavy industry, Pawaja, the steel industry, the automotive industry. Now we have to go into the digital industry. And currently, we have to help the tourism industry, for example. So industry policy depends on timing and the situation of the economic situation at the moment. Thank you.
I'd like to have a last word. Industrial policies depend on timing, there's no doubt of it. Depends on competition, depends on the capability that exists in the country. Like, for example, if you want to build aeroplanes, where none of our local universities have aerospace engineering, that would be disastrous. But that's exactly what Indonesia did. That's why Habibie's project was to build an aircraft industry. What the thing is, it's just like for any vehicle that moves in a stable manner, you need at least 2 wheels. So we have industrial policy, but you must also empower the private industry to be a driver of growth. In other words, these are not mutually exclusive. You shouldn't be taxing the private industry or keeping the private industry out from certain activities to be monopolized by a particular state-owned firm. Monopoly is in general not a great incubator of innovativeness. So I think that we must always keep in mind, does this industrial policy weaken the domestic private sector? And the other question is, what could we do to have an even more dynamic private sector? Basically, what can we do to persuade the private sector to invest more Because if you look at investment GDP ratio coming from the private sector, it's low. And it's low because, well, I would like to hear what members of the audience and the other two panelists think. I'm sure they can come up with quite a few reasons why the private investment GDP ratio is lower than in 1993. You know, look at the 5 years before the Asian financial crisis. We have never.
But I think certainly no competition would be stifling as well for innovation and for good, good products to arise, I would imagine. Yeah.
And it is not just industrial policy. Industrial policy has to be backed up by a very good education policy. We should fully mobilize our ultimate resource, the people, the brain power of this country. Then we will be able to implement good industrial policy as long as the government doesn't use it for political patronage. And only with a dynamic economy can we fully fund all these national level programs that will make us resilient to shocks like COVID-19 and be able to recover quickly from shocks like COVID-19. That, I think, is the key. We mustn't just think of industrial policy. We also think of it's a good idea as long as it is not at the cost of killing a goose that definitely been laying the golden eggs. That's important.
Thank you very much, Prof.
Otherwise, we end up with just egg on our face.
Goose eggs.
City goose.
Does Dato and Ravi has anything to share?
Yeah, on private investment, I think Prof has actually asked. I'm sure that's a question all policymakers are thinking. But if you ask businessmen like myself, again, to invest in Malaysia, it's tough. It is actually tough. Yeah. Where do we compete? I mean, if you like, even like a steel mill, how do you spend so much money when there's imports coming in from China, etc., at such low cost? Yeah, it is challenging. So I suppose and even like Dr. Aziz said, it's a lot about it is actually finding the timing is right and so forth. But if you ask me, it's tough to find a good investments to do.
I have something else to add in. I feel that we should also perhaps think about new sectors that we can, not new as in you have to invent a new sector, but as in identify key sectors that Malaysia wants to look at. So, for example, rather than say competing on car manufacturing, which Malaysia will never be able to compete on a big competitive scale compared to other countries. Just an idea, is it worth looking into, say, services sector and try to compete with Singapore in terms of consulting services and, this kind of servicing industry. And from there, develop more and more policies to encourage these sectors to grow. And certainly using what Mazzucato have been saying is that if we identify this as a project, as a project that we want to orient ourselves towards, then you can lay out the plans on how do you approach it, how do you fund it, and Prof. Wu has, you mentioned a good point about not stifling the market itself. How do you work with the private sector to ensure that you provide the fertile ground for this to grow, and from there clearly education plays a big part, which is one of the questions that is coming out in the Q&A here, where I think one of the anonymous attendee was saying, kids everywhere in the neighboring countries are going to school, but ours haven't. So will we have lost a generation? So then education comes in and orient our skills towards that. One of the key issues here that I felt on especially on jobs is that the skills that people have, suddenly, they realize that the value is not there because these companies are shutting. So how do you address that? That is also another key point. But I cut you there, Ravi. So please.
Maybe if I just comment a quick one. Yeah. Now, Prof mentioned earlier about what sectors. We talked about Mazzucato's ideas, and one of the things that we've been trying to advocate is, okay, look at affordable homes. Yeah, that's something which we could, it could be state run if you do it correctly. Yeah, affordable homes. At the same time, you can also, if you're going to mix it with these ideas of innovation and so on, how can we make new materials using, stuff that, is environmentally more friendly, lower cost, lower construction and require lower foreign workers. I mean, that's something we really want. Yeah, and this is something we don't compete. Nobody can come and build a house in Malaysia, right? Except for some bad cases earlier, but no one can actually come and build houses. So that's a tremendous opportunity for the building industry, and then the whole value chain that goes down. So, again, it's about that. Education itself, with due respect to the academics, I learned what I learned at work. A lot of it comes from productive knowledge. I mean, university just gets you to a point. And it's about getting more sophisticated industries. You're only going to get good at doing engineering work if you're actually working in research and development. You're actually solving problems. The university professor can't teach you all that. So it's about productive knowledge. So how do we get our productive knowledge better? So if you got projects like this, I can see civil engineers, material scientists working on issues and getting, so again, role of government, private sector, and skills all actually merge. I mean, it's a long topic. So I think just say that and I'll quit down there. Give the others a chance to give their piece as well.
Dato, is there anything you would like to share? Yeah, I think we touched a lot today. If I may try to wrap up our session. In fact, the last, I think 15-20 minutes, we have actually been concluding, all the topics that we are talking about. I will just sort of quickly try to, I took a few notes. Let me just try and quickly conclude in a very, very, simple, it could be almost reductive sort of manner. Dato Aziz, we talked, you shared about the tax sort of perspective on how to look at improving the economy and funding it. I picked up the whole of society approach, where you're saying that perhaps businesses can also look at contributing actively to rebuild, let's put it this way, to rebuild the current situation as we are in. You also touch on perhaps broadening the tax base, which we continued the conversation throughout the entire session, and that Malaysia has become progressive in taxing the wealthier, but at the same time, participation is key. Is that although we have the economic instruments, but everybody needs to take it up and see what we can, what we can do. Ravi mentioned on rethinking economics. You are saying that unlike households in income, Malaysia government actually has the ability to borrow and invest heavily. And in fact, all the governments around the world are doing the same. And by implying also that we can actually do, and we should do more. And that in a crisis that the government should intervene and take a more active role, and that focusing on deficit spending, well, not really focusing, but I think your point here is that there's not much that we can do at this current stage apart from looking at deficit spending. And in a way, inflation and exchange rates are not really an issue. And we should increase the revenue raising capacity of the government. And perhaps also look at taxing capital gains on stock markets and looking at different sort of methods in that. Prof Wu gave a very, very overview on the world sort of situation. Specifically, you talked about the dual approach of the safety net and the prevention net. Dato Aziz has very kindly also shared on looking at safety harness. So you mentioned about the global set of actions and the players that are there. And how the multinational corporations should and can actually work together. WHO's role on not just information coordination, but also act as an advisory function, which is very important to help curb the pandemic, given how easily it spreads. And individual organizations, you talk about setting up a dense network of direct communication between major CDCs of the world, network communication between leading research centers of the world. I would very much like to see that and hope that it keeps going. Otherwise, I think a vaccination, it's really going to take a very, very long time. And you also talk about the national level, whereby Malaysia has been doing relatively well. The strengthening of the medical system needs to be looked at in terms of how public and private hospitals can play complementary roles. And you also talk about strengthening the economic relief program, and that the amount needed will be lower, obviously, if global action are successful and if the virus is kept in place. I think in a sense, I would say that we are actually in quite an interesting period. That it is a bit uncharted territories, dealing with a global crisis that most of us haven't seen before. Certainly, I haven't seen it before, and it's much bigger in terms of scale and amount compared to the global financial crisis and even the 1997 crisis. We are being hit by multiple whammies. We're looking at health crisis, economic crisis, humanitarian crisis, where one key thing that we haven't looked at. Sorry?
Political crisis as well.
Political crisis, yeah, that's the fourth one. On the humanitarian, we didn't really touch on refugees and migrant workers, which is obviously a very key issue pertaining to Malaysia's situation, not just in diseases control, but also re-looking at how we can look at our heavy reliance on foreign workers. I think we'll probably all agree and realize that in more than one way, that the impact of the last few months will stay with us for many, many more months and many, many more years to come. Yeah. So I would conclude as that, but I would like to invite all the speakers to just give last key takeaways that you have for the audience before we close this session. If any of you would like to start.
Trust the government.
Let's hope that they sort out the political instability as we are speaking. Every day and every hour seems to be different.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. All right.
Thank you, Dato. Ravi and Prof, is there anything you'd like to add?
No, just thank you, and thank you for moderating the session, Ivan. Thanks. It's a pleasure to be on the panel with such distinguished other speakers, and part of Malaysia Chamber of Commerce. I also thank all of you all for helping out.
Well, it's very heartening when the much criticized Malaysian bureaucracy is able to handle this pandemic so well in the middle of a political crisis when you don't know who's going to be your boss in the next few months. So I think we are institutionally strong enough to have higher growth than we have been experiencing. And I think it is obligatory for whoever the government continues to be, or is led by, to be able to make use adequately of our good bureaucracy to produce the growth that we potentially are able to achieve. So I'm very I just see the future as potentially a lot brighter. And after all, the US unemployment rate today actually dropped 1% point.
Yes.
So you could see that the recovery could be much faster than you think, largely because when the economy opens up and if safety is maintained, it will go back to where it was, definitely. So I think it's true that there was a prediction that there might be a recession 30 days from now. Or what was that the prediction by the head of the Statistics Bureau? 2 months. That is certainly a possibility. But now I think we see that together with the latest macro stimulus program, recovery might come faster. So we are ending this panel on a very optimistic note.
Absolutely. I was about to say that let's end this on a positive note, but at the same time, I think be aware of the new normal. Stay safe, especially Prof. Wu. We would very much like to see you very soon when our borders open and have a cup of teh tarik, just to brighten up your day as well. And Ravi, Dato Aziz, thank you very much for joining the session. And I would also like to thank MCCC, Malaysia China Chamber of Commerce, for having me and for having this very fruitful discussion. So I would like to close the webinar now. Thank you all to all the attendees to attend this on a Saturday morning. Wish you all a very good weekend. Stay safe and keep well. Goodbye.
Goodbye.